Hey, how's it going, everyone? Thank you for joining me on a new episode of the Music Reviewer Podcast. My name's Josh, and yeah, thanks for joining me on another YouTube only edition of the Music Reviewer Podcast. I'm just trying something new again with this, platform on YouTube. I might post this onto the actual podcast side where you can listen on the streaming service, depending on how well this episode does. But anyways, that's beyond the point. But first of all, I just want to welcome everyone. If this is the first time you're listening to the Music Reviewer Podcast, thanks for joining me. I'm just a guy that likes talking about music. Hopefully you do too. And I do usually album reviews, but seeing though that we're at the beginning of a new year, the album cycle for this calendar year hasn't quite started yet. And but I also do a weekly segment called Best and Worst Track of the Week, where I cover all the new entries onto the Billboard Hot 100, and I give each a letter grade and take one that's the worst, take one that's the best. But anyways, yeah, this is just a podcast about music. In this episode, I'm going to be just giving my thoughts on the Alternative 40 chart that is on Reddit, essentially. That's posted on the Indie Head subreddit every week, titled New Alternative 40 Chart. This is for the first week in January 3rd specifically. And it's essentially just a chart that's aggregated weekly from new releases, basically the stuff that's doing well on Spotify and YouTube from indie and alt music. I think this is just a good way to touch on stuff that is not ever going to be covered on Best and Worst Track of the Week, and maybe some artists that I might not even get a chance to review their albums. So yeah, let's see how this goes. But essentially the way this is going to go, I'm just going to go over the new entries, just give my thoughts on them, not necessarily rate them or anything, and then also just give my thoughts on some of like the higher charting stuff like the top 10. But essentially, yeah, we had an interesting track coming in at number 40 by the White Stripes, Let's Shake Hands. Now, if you're a White Stripes fan, you probably already screamed at me and said, this isn't a new song. You're right, it's not a new song. I don't know why this is counted as new. I think it was re-released or remastered or something. But this is essentially the very first single the White Stripes have ever released back in 1998. The track features a very raw and dirty opening guitar riff, very lenient on like the surfer rock style. It sounds a lot like you'd expect White Stripes' earlier material to sound like. A huge drum sound on here. I doubt Meg White played drums on this track, but I don't know. Typical Jack White guitar playing as well, just kind of very all over the place and technical to an extent. Very lo-fi. It sounds like they recorded in the living room because they did, and it was recorded live. But anyways, it's raw, it's powerful, it's big. I like it. Next track was by a band called Vacations. The track was titled Young. I've never heard of Vacations, or if I did, I just forgot that I'd listened to them. But this track sounds awfully similar to some early Mac DeMarco material, or just maybe like non-recent Mac DeMarco material, especially with that opening jingly guitar riff especially with that tone on there. But some very organic sounding production overall. Like I said, this is soaked with the Mac DeMarco influence, the opening riff and rhythmic guitar on there, all stuff I would expect to hear on some maybe like Salad Days or something like that. But I love the lovely crisp drum track on here, some nice cymbals in the mix. It features a pretty familiar smooth sounding voice, kind of typical of just like a band you'd expect to see at a college show or some stuff like that, with a very nice non-offensive voice, a nice and punchy bass line throughout this track that I dug. I feel like the vocal might be a little bit buried in the overall context of the mix. Like it's not very accentuated, which it doesn't really need to, but I thought it was an interesting track. I thought it was good. The next track was by an artist named Laurel, titled Appetite. I thought this was probably one of the better tracks. I love the indie pop flair on here. It features a nice, agile, groovy bass line that guides the track. And I think Laurel is this up-and-coming indie pop star. It's maybe from Europe, from the 2 seconds I read about her. But I loved the songwriting on here, where we get that transition to the chorus. It's very catchy. Also, like some typical elements of bands, like maybe like Foles with the melodic guitar material thrown in there. But I love the light and shimmering synth work on here as well. Fits the track quite well. Interesting vocal performance as well. It's passionate but not overwhelming. Not like it's trying to uh, serenade you, but it's still executed quite well. I dug the track. This next track was by Unknown Mortal Orchestra, SB-08. Now, this, if you are familiar with the band Unknown Mortal Orchestra, they're kind of like this psych indie rock outfit experimental project. They're kind of all over the place at this point, but I am a fan of the band. I've seen them live. This is not a typical, I guess, single you'd expect to hear from this band, so don't go into it expecting to listen to something that's probably going to be on an upcoming album for Unknown Mortal Orchestra. This is essentially an EP that's dragged out in a 20-minute long single. And it's very experimental. It's if I had to guess, it's probably done by the front man when he probably made this like in quarantine or something, and he felt like he wanted to release it. But the track overall, it has this chaotic opening with some sound bits for that form like this sort of collage in the soundscape. Some pretty blown out synth material that kind of guides the track. It's a bit abrasive. Like I said, quite experimental even for Unknown Mortal Orchestra. Very colorful, a lot of textures thrown in, and a lot of textures buried in the track that you can kind of pinpoint if you listen. The track can feel a little one-dimensional once it gets to the point, but but it does change because it is a 20-minute long song. And to be honest, once I got to like the 5 or 6 minute point and I realized this is more of like a EP, I didn't really stick out to hear the rest. It just wasn't my cup of tea. Maybe on another day I'll throw it on, maybe when I'm inebriated or something. But yeah, interesting stuff from Unknown Mortal Orchestra. The next track was by Alice Phoebe Liu, Dusk. I'm not familiar with Alice Phoebe Liu, but I thought the track was interesting. I love the fluttering vocal effect that's laid on the vocals here. It's a very loungy like instrumental with some rich keyboard and piano material over this mid-tempo beat. And a very nice introduction to the track with some woodwind elements here as well. It kind of reminded me of like some of the material that was on Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino, especially with the more melodic bass elements that come in on the track. Pretty interesting overall. Next track was by Hayley Williams, Find Me Here. This is a pretty straightforward track. I guess it's really not meant to be anything up and coming for like an album. If I had to guess, this feels like it's just kind of one-off. It's essentially just an acoustic performance by Hayley Williams. A nice vocal effect thrown in on there as well. But I like the pretty and sensitive guitar accompaniment that guides this track. And it's pretty simple track with just, like I said, vocals and guitar. Gets to the point quite quick. I don't think anyone really, though, is going to be quite flattered or just like in awe over this track. Hayley Williams definitely had some better material overall of her career. Not a bad track, though. The next track is actually going to be the same artist for the next two. This interesting project by Tom York, Birol, and Fortet. The first track was His Rope. If you're familiar with this artist, or these artists actually, you probably wouldn't be surprised with how these singles turned out. His Rope in particular had like these dry percussive textures with some ambient synth textures as well, and electronic elements thrown in all over the place with Tom's signature vocals that fit quite nicely over the track. And some lovely synth strings come in more as the track develops, and there is a nice groove established to the track overall, I'll give it that, but it's pretty low-key, and it creates kind of like this murky mood throughout the track. I thought it was interesting. The next track by these artists, Her Revolution, I found to be maybe a tad more interesting. Another ambient track with like this floating like nature to it. A nice staticky effect in the soundscape as well, and I dig the random melodic bits that don't really seem to be like going anywhere. Kind of makes the track sound a bit unsteady. But it's almost Radiohead-like somewhere in between like Kid A and OK Computer. That's what I thought ended up being the most interesting part of this track, but yeah. Pretty cool stuff. Next track was by The Neighborhood, Stargazing. If you're familiar with The Neighborhood, this track, it's probably no surprise. I honestly have not listened to a lot of their recent material, even though they just put out an album. And They changed a bit since they first came out. And kudos to the Neighborhood. They've been out for almost like 10 years at this point. I remember being like senior in high school, like when their Sweather Weather came out. I think that was around the time. And they're still around. They certainly didn't get as big as many people thought they might have, but this is kind of like more like Foster the People meets the Killers. I don't know. It's upbeat and poppy. The track sounds quite different from like their early material. It's guided by this typical alternative syncopated bass line. And there is a lovely transition to the second verse that I like from the chorus that introduces these colorful and bright guitar embellishments. Some more pronounced vocal moments too, with like some smooth runs. I can see the frontman of the Neighborhood certainly worked on his vocal chops. Honestly, kind of just sounds like a version of like a Killers track minus Brandon Flowers. The guitar material, the instrumental interlude though, later in the track is very Strokes-like. It's like super noticeable. Just very derivative alternative rock. It's not bad. It's not great either. The next track was by Kelsey Lou and Yves Tumor. Don't know if I said Yves Tumor's name right, but funny thing, I kind of really wanted to review his album that came out earlier this year when the podcast first started. I was just a little intimidated by covering certain things at that point. But the name of this track is Let All the Poisons That Lurk in the Mud Seep Out. It's a very long track. Pretty interesting overall. Kelsey Lou, I believe, lays down the vocals here. And it honestly sounds a little like Bjork. There's a lovely, serene opening with some light piano textures and a mid-tempo compound time signature going on. And it kind of reminds me of like some of the material off of like From Indian Lakes, like their Blank Take single, or from that album, if you're familiar with that band. It's a little avant-garde, and there's some implementation of like strings as well that I thought was interesting. Some lovely auxiliary percussion that gives the track some flavor that's later thrown in. I thought it was a good track. The next track was actually pretty cool. It was by Crosses, The Beginning of the End. This is Chino Moreno's side project. There's a very bouncy and synthy opening, and I don't know really what the gist of this track is trying to get to, other than it's trying to sound like Depeche Mode. There's some super noticeable Depeche Mode flavor on here with the 80s and industrial dark nature. But I do like the pacing of this track. It doesn't try to go anywhere too fast, and there's some deep sub bass that adds a nice flavor to everything. But at the end of the day, it sounds like a Depeche Mode track. If that's what Crosses are going for, or if that's what Crosses is going for, that's great. But I don't really know what Crosses sounds like after that point. But overall, the track has a nice mood, nice dynamics, and the developmental bridge part is tastefully soft too. So I like how they give contrast overall on the track. So yeah, good track. The next track was by Gorillaz featuring Lee John, The Lost Chord. I thought this was a cool track. I love the spacey and eerie opening of the synths here. A classic Gorillaz groove, bass groove with pocket drumming, and it kind of structures the track, and it sounds familiar, honestly. Some lovely, breathy supporting vocals on here, and I love the energy that the drum track brings to this. I thought it was done quite well, and the track has a bit of like a crowded and busy nature to it, especially on the second verses when more voices are being introduced, but the track still keeps its overall nature, and I thought it was pretty decent. This next track is by this band called Chems, or this DJ producer called Chems, titled Burial. Honestly, I like this track, but I feel like the 7-minute runtime was a little too unnecessary. But I love the electronica and indie EDM flavor on here with this house flair that kind of reminds me of like this 90s European dance club stuff. And I love the crackling effect on that production as well, with this synth crescendo build-up in the earlier part of the track with it kind of feels like a little bit drum and bass too, but the track does go for like these dramatic shifts with different filters at times or different variations of the same theme. It's basically elongated after a certain point. The middle of the track also takes like this interesting turn that ends up sounding like Grimes. And then there's like a third part, a C section with like kind of very abrasive, but I kind of lost interest at this point. Pretty cool track overall, just kind of long. The next track was No Son of Mine by Foo Fighters. I feel like they're about to drop a new album because this is the second single I've heard recently. I feel like the first one I dug considerably more. This track honestly is not bad. There's some lovely panning guitar effect thing going on in the intro. It kind of has like this arena cock rock nature to it, very sinister too, with Grohl's vocals on here. The main chorus, though, kind of just sounds like a ripoff or a variation of Ace of Spades, especially in the guitar groove. Just sounds a bit borrowed, and there's really not much to say. It's a straightforward, solid rock track, but they've done better. And the next track is actually the highest charting on the new side. It's Liberty Bell featuring, Liberty Bell by Darkside. Honestly, I'm not too familiar with Darkside. I know this is a prominent artist that's been around for a while, but I really like this track. There's a lovely psych nature to it and an interesting vocal effect on the vocals as well. With some light organic instrumentation, it creates a really nice effect. It kind of reminds me of like early Broken Bells material. And I love the pulsing bass line on here as well. I love the plucked classical guitar solo once we get to an interlude later in the track. And the track builds up a lot of anticipation and tension. I like the songwriting capabilities there, and I like the track. It's probably one of the better tracks this week on these new entries. But yeah, that's kind of what my thoughts were on this top 40 chart thing I found on Reddit. The top 10 had some interesting highlights, though. Caroline Polachek did this cover of Shania Twain's Breathless at number 3. It felt a little unnecessary, but I really do like Caroline Polachek for the most part on all of her stuff. The Voids track, Alien Crime Lord, thought that was a really nice track, actually. I dug that. Cherry Glazer's Rabbit Hole, I know I listened to it, but honestly, I've heard better Cherry Glazer. That's probably a good track, but yeah, don't really remember too much. Also, there is a Haim remix from their latest album by Tori Ma, 3 a.m. It sounded fine, but I didn't really hear any like signature traits of Tori Ma that I would have liked to hear. But anyways, yeah, nothing else really though that stuck out to me. There is a King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard track, If Not Now, Then When. I think that's just probably one of the better tracks off of their latest album. So I think it's a pretty decent track, but if you would have to listen to something off that album, try that track. But other than that, yeah, I don't know how regularly I'm going to be doing this sort of, I guess, review of this the material on this chart. So if you dug it, thanks for listening. I'll check in with it probably periodically. If I find some tracks that I really like and I want to talk about. But anyways, yeah, thanks for tuning on this episode of the Music Reviewer Podcast. My name's Josh. If you're on your... Don't say that. I'll be reviewing some more music soon. Take care of yourselves.